Okay. And we're discussing the results of the European elections. Now, I know that we in the UK no longer have a dog in this fight, so to speak, but uh, the, the results of the European Parliament elections are significant in a way. I saw some people like Andrew Neil in the UK saying that these aren't very significant, and really these are more just a kind of polling of how people are feeling. They're probably a bit more significant than that, but we're just going to discuss the outcome of them. But just before we started, I think Mark and Richard, you guys wanted to just give people an overview of how these elections work. So why don't you give us that?
Yes, before we get to the nitty-gritty of the election itself, I'd like to make a point that after the United Nations, the European Union is represent the greatest denial of individual rights and the largest fraud ever perpetrated on against individual citizen in a whole continent. The so-called European Parliament is just the veneer that makes it look like a legitimate organization. Now, why I'm saying this? Well, first of all, the parliament is supposed to be a legislative body, but this specific legislative body doesn't have the power to initiate legislation. All it does is a consultative and advisory role that has towards the legislation produced by the unelected and unaccountable European Commission. Sometimes it's not even the question is not even given to the Parliament to discuss. And generally, the Parliament, all it does, gets a report on a piece of legislation that the European Commission puts through, and all they're allowed to vote is on the report, whether they accept the report or not. So there's nothing, although from the outside, it all looks like an exercise in democracy and freedom, all it is just a big con. Now, the parliament has 720 seats, and these seats are filled by members of the 27 member states, people chosen, elected locally. The allocation of seats is done on a sort of population basis. So I think Germany is the one that got higher seats than France and Italy, and off you go. Of course, this also represents there are kind of parties or groups in the European Parliament, but these are European parties and European groups. Those groups and parties are not made up by normal people, but they are made up by members of a party of the member state. So you have the electors, the citizen in the member state, vote for their party in their own state. Then the party which is elected groups together under the umbrella of the European Parliamentary Party. So you have this kind of double insulation from the citizen to the so-called parliament. And then in itself, it's another arm's length democracy. The parliament itself costs 2 billion to run, 2 billion euros every year. And it has got two headquarters, one in Strasbourg, because France couldn't possibly give up the chance of having a European body in its own land, and in Brussels, because Brussels is considered the capital of the European Union.
Okay, just to clarify what Marco just said there, that 2 billion is just the admin for running the parliament. There's nothing to do with the budget for what the parliament spends on any of its deals or its programs or any of that. That's simply the admin side of it. So, I mean, that's a pretty hefty sum to start with. I think it's worth stating for our audience, whether in Europe or whether you're in Europe, whether you're not, that it's complex. It's complex for people in Europe as well. And almost nobody, and I mean this for real, I'm not exaggerating, almost nobody, if you went up to them in the street, would have the slightest clue what the umbrella name of the party that they were voting for in their own country sits under. they wouldn't be able to name the European People's Party or the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats or the Renew Party or the Greens European Free Alliance or any of these names that are shoved together that umbrella the little parties within it from all the different countries across Europe. And we're talking about 27 countries. And in order to form one of those groupings, you need at least 23 members of parliament from at least seven countries represented under them. And then they get a share of 40 million euros a year to run themselves, and each leader of each group gets the right to speak in Parliament first. So that's kind of how it works. And this is, as Marco said, 720 seats. They're often called lawmakers, but as Marco pointed out, that's really a bit bogus, to say the least. And if you're comparing with other countries, I'm cautious on the word lawmakers because they're law signer offers or voters honours, if you want. And I think just before I throw back to you, because I realise I'm talking for quite a bit here, there are 27 countries in the EU. It's easy to just say that and gloss over it. So I do want to just read the list quickly. And as I read it, I just want you to picture the different languages involved, the different parts of Europe, if you can visualize them on a map quickly, and the different kind of cultures that you immediately, as they represent, just to get a flavor of it. So we're talking about Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark. I want you to think of Estonia and Finland. Then you've got France, Germany, and Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg and Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, and Sweden. Now, we cannot be experts in the politics of all those countries, and a lot of what people are voting on are their local politics, and in reaction to their local politics, and giving a chance to flick the bird by voting in the European elections against their own elected government, even if because they don't especially care about how the EU works as much as they care about their own national governments. That's the best intro I can do.
Yeah, so well, as you say, there's more countries really involved than we can really cover. But I think so broadly, the results of this election, the way people are reflecting on it is that the kind of establishment parties, the parties that belong to a lot of the actual governments in various of these countries, have done relatively poorly, particularly in Germany and France, who I think are some of the major kind of ones we'll look at. And people seem to vote differently in the European elections, maybe than they do in their national general elections. That was certainly in the UK, you saw a different kind of spread of parties gaining seats in the European Parliament than you would see in Westminster or anything like that. So as you say, people almost use this as a chance to say what they really think or to give a bloody nose to the kind of ruling parties. And one of the main takeaways that people are having is seeing that the people who are considered far right, which is accurate in some cases, and in some cases as more kind of Eurosceptic parties have done really quite well at this round of elections. And certainly so, maybe if we start with France, where the results have been quite so devastating for Macron. I think I can't remember the actual vote share that his ones ended up getting, but I think they lost quite a lot of their share, and then a lot of it went to Marine Le Pen's party, which has caused Macron to call a general election within France as a result of this. So, what did you guys make of that?
Yeah, I mean that's quite telling. And as we were trying to make the point earlier on, the European election really doesn't matter at all as European election, as it matters because it represents, as you were saying, kind of a weather vane for the single individual state. And you said it's true. Some people vote just to give a bloody no to the government. But for example, like I think in Germany, they seem to be fairly consistent. That they vote for who they want to vote, which would translate to a general election within the state of Germany. So those kind of results are not always a reaction against the a vote against the people I don't like. So France is specifically Macron it was presenting a different group again from the previous election, because in the meanwhile he's lost the majority in parliament, in the French parliament. So effectively he got 16% of the vote, and Marine Le Pen, the great opposition, the what's it called, RN,
Rassemblement National,
yeah, whatever, the National Assembly, whatever. She had 31%. So he nearly has 50% of the votes that the biggest competitor has. And this prompted him to fire off a general election for, when is it? At the end of June, I think.
Yeah.
Similarly, the Prime Minister in Belgium, who got a serious trouncing, resigned today because his party did so incredibly well, but badly. I think he got less than 6%, and so he was like fifth or sixth position. And the two parties who did the best were about 14% share each.
So yeah, should I chip in at that point? Just to give you a couple of facts about France before we go too far. So yeah, so Macron's called a surprise election, which has caught everybody by surprise, including his own party, including the mayor of Paris, who's not a member of his party, Anne Hidalgo, but is of course set to run the Olympics or have the Olympics in Paris I think it's starting on the 28th of July or something like that. And Macron's called an election that's going to have two dates to it, the 30th of June and the 7th of July. So that's thrown a spanner in the works for everybody. Even his finance minister said it could have the most serious consequences in modern French history. That's Macron's own finance minister for calling this surprise election result. And it's because his party got, Macron's party got 15% of the vote here. And Marine Le Pen's National Rally, I'll call it, got 31% of the vote, so more than double Macron. And that's unlikely to be reflected in that scale at an election for the National Assembly in France come the end of the month. But it does show that there's one party very much on the rise and one party very much on the fall. And Macron's group, he's part of the Renew group, one of the most pro-European groups in the parliament. That was one of those that overall lost more than the others in its umbrella party. More representation went down than the others. It went from like 14% to about 11%. Doesn't sound huge. None of these movements overall sound huge. And one of the problems here is, you mentioned it with far right. The term far right is bandied about all over the place. It can mean people I don't like. It can mean people who say anti-Islam things. It can mean people who are against the European Union. It can mean genuine far right people who use fire extinguishers on a menorah at Hanukkah, for example, as in one particular country. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. So. And of course, that applies to all the others. If you're taking the word liberal or Democrat or centre-right, you could mean a centre-right party that's pro-European, or a centre-right that's more anti-European, more sceptical. So a lot of the names that don't translate from one country to another, and certainly don't automatically mean which umbrella party it would sit underneath. There we are.
Yes. I mean, I think... So France and Germany, I think, are probably the most significant results of this. And when I was speaking with Antoine about French politics, I think maybe it was back in December. Certainly, Marine Le Pen's National Rally does well at various things like this, but Antoine was kind of skeptical about whether they would really prevail in any of the presidential elections, because, as I remember it, the way that French elections work is they have, a couple of rounds of voting, and in the first rounds, people lend their support to the National Rally, and then when the crunch comes in the later rounds, they default to the more centrist parties. So we'll see exactly how this reflects for Macron. Although I do have to say, whilst I don't have any affection at all for Marine Le Pen, I think she's a really bad thing. It is always slightly satisfying to see Emmanuel Macron get a bloody nose, because I think he's awful.
I mean, the election is for the National Assembly, which is the parliament. It's a bit like the President of the United States and the Congress. Macron will stay until the end of his term, but his prime minister, his government, will be probably changing according to the changes of the new parliament. Le Pen is projected to have a majority in the parliament itself, which would effectively force Macron to get a government which is not of his liking. And so some of the questions why he had this kind of seemingly strop and threw the toys out of the pram and went to election makes you wonder whether actually, because the situation is fairly dire at the moment economically and politically, whether he wants Marine Le Pen to grasp some of the nettles that he's been creating lately and then use it in the next presidential election to point at her and say, they're not very good, they're screwed up and all this kind of stuff. So, who knows? Germany, to be honest, France and Germany, another significant outcome of this election is the collapse of the Green vote. People are obviously fed up with the net zero and this kind of climate ridiculous claims that have been bandied about for the last 5-10 years. So there's definitely a reaction. Germany, usually the Green Party is the reservoir of none of the above votes. The Germans tend to vote Green, sometimes because of legitimate reasons, but often as a protest vote, and often, like in the case of the 90s or something, they actually form a government.
Just on the subject of the Green, just to cut in a second there, overall, when you're looking at the Green umbrella parties across Europe, which is one of the categories, they used to have 10% in the parliament and they're now down to 7%. So again, they don't sound like massive moves, but across all of the aggregation of people from different parties, they are quite significant, and they're where the changes have occurred, which is why we're emphasizing them.
Yeah, and it's also important to note that we say Green parties, but a Green party in Britain, a Green party in Germany, a Green party in Greece, they're not exactly the same thing. So that's another quirk of the European Parliament. You have parties that sometimes they even use the same words in the name, but they often represent the same thing. So as a citizen, you really don't know what you're voting for in terms of ultimately, you vote for your own national party, which has this total manifesto, but then that manifesto doesn't necessarily translate in the European grouping. But going back to German, the Olaf Scholz's Social Democrat Party, the Socialists, got to third place, was pushed to third place behind the winner, the CDU, the former Angela Merkel party, and the AfD, which is the far right party, which could be a bit of an issue. So we're definitely seeing a swing to the right. Generally, some countries actually went the opposite direction. Spain, for example, the Socialist Party of Pedro Sanchez just got left behind by 4% by the Conservative Party. Yeah, but apart from that, nothing really major until we get to proper national elections. Nothing will change as such.
But one of the things that is noticeable, that no matter who's in charge in whichever country we're talking about, more often than not, with a handful of exceptions, which we can talk about, more often than not, the party that isn't in charge, one of the others won. And the party that currently leads that country came second, or sometimes third, or sometimes, in the case of Belgium, way down the list with less than 6%. So there's a lot going on there. I think the Green thing is quite interesting, because one of the things that EU has been banging on about lately, you may not have heard of any of these parties we're talking about in the EU, but you've certainly heard the two-word phrase Green Deal parroted at you ad nauseum for years now. Nobody really understands what's in it. It's just a Green Deal. But I mean, it is supposed to contain climate neutrality by 2050 with €1,000 billion investment fund. When they say investment fund, trying to understand what they mean, whether they mean taxation or whether they mean they're going to borrow it. it is hard to ascertain half the time. But certainly there's been with lots of protests across Europe from farmers, blocking roads in all sorts of countries, in Spain, France in particular. You've seen a lot of pushback, and you've seen pushback in terms of people, being pushed towards electric cars, and having the date by which you could buy a petrol car may therefore, as a result of all this, be extended a bit longer, so you can still buy a petrol car for longer. And things like your own household boiler, and the expense for changing that in some countries has been an issue, because that's all been part of this net zero climate deal stuff foisted on from the EU. And even the centre right parties have stepped back a little, seeing the way the wind is blowing, from being quite so pro green as they were in the past. Because the cost of living, and now it's actually hitting, and it's not just a theoretical concept, but it means that you may have to go without, you may have to pay more, you may have to have inferior products in order to achieve what they're talking about. All of those things have caused some backlash.
Yes, looking at the response to the election results, particularly around the Greens declining in the vote share that they're getting, I didn't see many people seeming to draw the conclusion, which I think would have to be the reason why, which I guess is what you're getting at, Richard, which is that after the invasion of Ukraine, the massive kind of energy problems that we saw across Europe, I presume that the lack of support that we've seen here for the Green parties is because people see that we're going to get into a real problem if we continue pursuing some of these policies. I mean, Germany shutting down its coal power stations, shutting down its nuclear power stations exactly at the time when it needs to not be doing that. I think people have seen that that's really crazy, and that people need a reliable source of energy. And so, again, there's been a bit of silence about, well, look, I think people are losing confidence in the idea that the Greens, who are very influential in Europe, and certainly kind of green policy is very much associated with Europe, that this just isn't something that we can rely on for the future. I think that's surely the conclusion we have to take from this. Now, they're still getting some support, and that seems a bit crazy given that. But I think that this shows this decline in confidence for this kind of stuff.
And of course, one of those features in the Green Deal tells you an awful lot about how Europe works anyway, which is that they want to increase tariffs on countries outside of the EU who they deem to be not as friendly towards the climate, because part of their MO and is as a protectionist racket, I would argue. So a lot of it is badged under a good motive, sold as a motive that's good for the planet, etc., but is actually a way of imposing additional taxes or tariffs or subsidies at every level. So I think some of that's what people are either voting against, or in some cases, if they see themselves as or their industry as a personal beneficiary of a subsidy, their vote can be essentially, bought on that basis, and that explains some of the continuing Green vote.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the Green Deal is not just a policy that the European Commission came up with, but that was the spearhead of the campaign from Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the Commission, the outgoing president of the Commission. When she came in 5 years ago, her main policy, she actually was elected by a debatable process, because she was pushing this Green Deal business. And Green Deal for the EU only means subsidies, more shifting of trillions of taxpayer money into various dodgy businesses and enterprises and God knows where.
And so then I guess the other aspect of this is Italy, and Meloni's party getting greater support has been a factor in this. Marco, why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, there's not much to say, really. I mean, she won as the biggest party a couple of years ago, I think, and she confirmed herself as the leader of the biggest party. So, under the point of view, the politics in Italy is fairly stable. Of course, people are fed up with the green stuff, and there are big issues with immigration at the moment. And the left party, the equivalent of the British Labour Party, Democratic Party is called, are not making the kind of gain that they should have been making, because they are wedding themselves to old, tired, unwanted policies. And they didn't collapse as such. They never collapse because there is a massive base that will vote red, whatever. Yeah, frankly, I don't think it's a massively significant change or a massively significant event in the first place, because things change in Italy. You know, Berlusconi comes and goes, and somebody else comes with 5 stars. You know, things are fairly fluid. There isn't a coherent direction in Italy, and so
I think a couple of things about Giorgia Meloni. Her party is called Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy. They won 24 seats, and then the left wing Labour Party equivalent got 21 seats and came second. And that's a rare case where the party leading the country wins this European vote as well. And that's because Giorgia Meloni is already one of those who is pushing back on immigration, who is already representing the kind of vote that has been increasing across all the other European parties across this election. She's already in charge there. So that's a reflection of that in part. She also doesn't sit in the identity and democracy group, which is the group that many of those from those quotes far right parties sit under. She sits in one slightly above it called the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists, and in fact her party kind of dominates that particular group. And she has kind of since she's been elected as the leader in Italy, she's kind of moved a bit more towards a working relationship with the EU. So the EU was petrified when she got elected, quite frankly, and yet she has tried to make it. She's tried to work with them as much as possible. And therefore she's actually in one of the strongest positions as a result of this election. And when later this week there's going to be a big G7 meeting in Puglia in southern Italy, and she is going to be important there, and she could well be the kingmaker in terms of deciding who will lead the parliament and whether Ursula von der Leyen keeps her position at the top of it.
Yeah, just provide a bit of context here. The reason why she's collaborating with the EU is because the EU was withholding a massive amount of billions from largesse bestowed upon people during the COVID period. So there was a stash of billions ready to be given to Italy if they play ball. So, you know, a pragmatic choice was to pretend to care, not particularly because she particularly loves the EU, but because at the particular time, you know, the billions come handy. So I wouldn't read that one as a pro-EU party.
Yes, and well, I guess just with Italy, I think the Forza Italia, I think, did they do slightly better around this time around, but they're still suffering overall? I think, is that right?
Yeah, well, they're going to be out of favor because, you know, after the death of Berlusconi, it was very much a person's party. So they're kind of floating along. They're more or less unchanged. The one who really disappointed was the Matteo Salvini's party, the Lega. Even I think the original founder of the party, kind of suggested not to vote for him. So that's one is falling apart. But the interesting thing that Salvini was one of the people who was propping up the technocratic government held by Mario Draghi, the former ECB president and former Bank of Italy chairman. And Mario Draghi is one of the people who's supposed to take over the job from Ursula von der Leyen as the president of the European Commission. So it will be interesting to see how a Draghi Commission will actually be will do, even if the guy who was supporting is not done very well.
And Italy's a classic basket case of parties in many ways, isn't it? I mean, the Forza Italia one that you mentioned there was Berlusconi's party. There was one high up member within it recommending that people crossed it out and wrote Berlusconi on their actual ballot form, even though he's dead, because, you know, his mystique lasts longer than his, you know, the breath in his body. So it's
a good thing people don't start writing Benito on it.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, this is a digression, but as much as I think probably if I were in Italy, I probably wouldn't have liked Berlusconi at all. There was this great story I remember hearing once of Berlusconi sitting at one of these kind of, awful commissions that they have, the countless ones they have in the European Parliament, right? And one of the kind of German statesmen was standing up, I'm forgetting his name, and Berlusconi, really having no time for this guy, called in this sort of beautiful, Miss Italy, whatever supermodel to come in and start handing out watches to all the other politicians who were suddenly more interested in looking at these watches than listening to the speech. So, Berlusconi's a amusing figure, certainly. And I guess the other trend of this, which isn't wholly new for the European Parliament, but which seems notable this time around, is the big swell in support for kind of, I guess you'd say, anti-immigration parties. I think that's certainly what we've seen in the Netherlands. I think is it the Freedom Party who've done really quite well out of this one as well.
Geert Wilders, yeah, well,
yeah, they came second. They got about 17% of the vote,
but it translated into 6 more seats that they didn't have before.
So. Yeah, so they're definitely on the rise. They didn't top that particular poll, but it's certainly increasing. There was a number of the Freedom Party in Austria came top, and they're from the anti-immigration end of the scale, but one of the things that they want to do, for example, I think, is strip the EU. They're a sort of Eurosceptic party, and they were talking at one point, I think, about pulling Austria out, but they've weakened that stance and been arguing since for stripping the EU of their powers and halving their budget, and they won in Austria. So
can I just make a point that particular party in Austria, the Freedom Party, there is a similar party in Germany called Freedom Party, German Freedom or whatever, who's actually in the coalition now with Scholz propping up, and it's a kind of libertarianish conservative party, but the two of them are totally different. I mean, not totally different, but they have significant differences. And that's when you have two similar parties with similar names that actually don't stand for the same thing. In fact, I think they sit in different grouping in the parliament. So this is an additional level of complexity to understand the European politics. Luckily, it doesn't really matter much.
Yeah, all you need to know about Germany is the 3 parties that are in the coalition of which Scholz currently leads all came after both the opposition Merkel's party and the Alternative for Germany. So all 3 of them were given a electoral equivalent of a kick in the balls.
So, I mean, I guess in terms of the consequences of this, then, speaking about, okay, so the Green vote seems to be suffering as people are seeing some of the consequences of that we've been experiencing in the last few years. But what, if Andrew Neil is wrong, that if there's some significance to this, what are the kind of takeaways or the lessons that people should be learning from the results of the European elections? What do you guys think?
Do you want to go first?
Well, the significance is that lots of countries are actually turning right. They are reacting to the years of imposed immigration and imposed green deals and all this kind of stuff. Nobody voted for, nobody wanted, but we all find it. Having pushed the electric cars, I'm quite happy to go with my diesel car, but I'm not allowed anymore. So people are reacting to that. People are reacting to the fact that farming is being attacked, food production is being attacked. Farmers are finding harder and harder to be able to produce food in the same way they've been doing until now, because they have massive targets and prohibition and massive regulation. So in a way, it's a swing back towards an attempt to reduce the reach of the state and the kind of regulation. So under the point of view, it's probably good news. However, if that translates in a swing towards a more nationalistic, less cooperative kind of sets of parties, more far right, traditionally far right, that's not exactly a promising start.
It's very difficult to interpret, and it depends on which commentators you listen to as to what slant you're going to get, especially as to how pro-European they are. Because I mean, there's some good arguments for why the EU shouldn't exist, as some of which I hope we've laid out. But often the idea that all of these countries would end up at war with each other as if the Second World War will be back tomorrow if it wasn't for the EU saving everybody. It is palpable nonsense. And when it talks about nationalist risings within countries, that can mean the kind of stuff that would worry us in some places and in some parties, but it can also mean we just want to have the chance to rule ourselves and not find that our legislation is imposed on us from the EU or from the exterior. I think there were a couple of things that I thought were really interesting in the run up to the election that were again twisted by media coverage in a different attempts to manipulate how people would vote, for example. I mean, one was the incident in Mannheim in Germany, where at a rally for an anti-Islam party, which is how they're described, that was warning about the dangers of violent Islamic extremism. A violent Islamic extremist, allegedly, popped out of nowhere with a knife and started trying to stab everyone. And then a policeman intervened, and he was stabbed in the neck and died as a result from this extremist Islamic person's knife. Terrorist, whatever you want to call it. And then that led to some turmoil within that particular city, which is a fairly quiet city, as I understand it anyway, a fairly quiet town. And yet that was spun as a look at, it's the anti-Islam parties that lead to violence. Now, it wasn't the anti-Islam parties that had the knife; they were warning about the knife. So again, that kind of depends on your spin. And then there was the incident in Finland with Denmark, with the leader of the Prime Minister in Denmark, 41-year-old, her name's Mette Frederiksen, with the Social Democrats. Now, she was walking in a town square in like 4 days before the election, and she got shoved over by someone. Now, for a while, they just said a man, and she was described in various ways as having light whiplash. It was described as being beaten at one point, even though it seems to have happened, because it's a terrible, to have a prime minister shoved over by some random person is not good. But to imply that they were beaten by somebody, and to imply that was well, they wouldn't say what that was. In the run up to election, several days before the electorate go to the polls, they sort of tried to keep it a secret. Now, they've since charged a person who's a 39-year-old Polish person who's being described as drunk and not totally mentally with it, and can't really remember the incident, and didn't seem to know who she was or think, and it doesn't seem to be politically motivated. But the electorate across Europe was led to believe that tied together with what happened to the Slovak prime minister a few weeks ago when he was shot, which is a quite different level of violence and incident, which, again, terrible, not underplaying that remotely. But there was this implication from a lot of the commentariat and the political parties that Europe is becoming a dangerous place. We need to vote for safety. You need to vote for the parties that you know already, and out of one side of the mouth, be aware of all these new parties and this far right stuff. So I did see rather a lot of that, the electorate being played on that, and I'm not sure that any of that works, but it shows how panicky some of the traditional parties have been as they've been over the course of the last decades losing power within the EU.
So something else we haven't mentioned, it's the turnout. The turnout is generally fairly low for the European elections. It went from a low of about 30% in Slovakia to highs of 60% in Germany. Germany is often fairly high, but it's been known to have even a lower percentage of that. But that's kind of an average of 50% turned out for the election. So even from those numbers, you can infer that people are not exactly sold on the whole exercise.
Yeah, I guess you're bringing up, Richard, the Islamic terrorism. I guess part of what we're seeing in the results is the continuing problem of Europe of integrating Muslim immigration in the last few years and the dissatisfaction with that, because there seems to be this kind of awful trend where because we're multicultural, we don't know who we are. We don't really have a good sense of our own identity. You get a wave of immigration coming in from cultures where they have let's say, a stronger sense of who they are, or they don't want to integrate into the cultures that they're moving into, and then that produces resentment, but some degree of xenophobia, and as a kind of backlash because people are saying, well, this is crazy. We can't just have all of these problems coming in, and so you see this kind of swing to the right, and it's not perhaps as devastating as some people might imagine it is, but certainly the swing to the far right, as it's described, which again sometimes is legitimate description, sometimes not quite so much. There still seems to be this resentment across Europe broadly against this kind of problem, and unfortunately, since I think even some of those parties don't really have a good conception of what their own cultural identity really is or really should be, there's this awful kind of, I don't know, acceleration or race to the bottom in some of these countries because you have no real solution being provided by either side of this. And as you were saying, some people not even really want to identifying that Islam was involved, I think, in that attack was how you were describing it. And then you have the other people who will say, oh no, Islam is involved, but we're representing a really unsavory kind of brand of reactionary politics on the other hand. So I think that kind of trend continuing in Europe is a cause for depression broadly, given that there's no real solution being presented by either side. Do you guys agree with that? Or
yeah, I think so broadly. I think the electorate is trying to nudge all of the main parties who've had their fingers in their ears for too long to adjust some of what they haven't listened to in the past. I think that's a better, that's really the intent behind most, let's call them moderate voters who are choosing to express a frustration with levels of immigration and the effect on their own countries and their ability to find housing, schools, and all of the kind of things that a large influx of any new number without, especially when the welfare state is such a dominant factor within Europe. So. And of course, there's been a lot of flouting of rules in terms of how the EU works. So, I mean, when immigrants from abroad come into the European Union, they're supposed to be housed in the first country that they hit, especially if they're asylum seekers, for example. And yet that frequently doesn't happen. And often countries sort of get them on buses and help farm them across the nearest border, or at least encourage them to move on somewhere else within Europe. And therefore, those at the front line of, like Italy, for example, down towards, with Lampedusa and islands that are close to Africa, that often receive migrants that way, and certain countries further east that have an influx, and of course, a lot of that gets pushed around different parts of the EU, and basically the EU has been gradually understanding a bit more, I think, that it needs to have a clearer set of rules. And it's been kind of watching the UK government with its frankly ridiculous Rwanda policy, and talking a little bit about having something of their own in a sense of trying to process people outside of the EU before they reach the continent to determine whether they are pass for asylum status or not, or at least trying to offshore the assessment of people, rather than. But of course, all of that could simply be pre-election talk, and it will depend on how people react here on.
Yeah, the main problem is that the EU is a social democracy favoring high welfare expenditure, economically protectionist, and with a massive democratic deficit. And the fact that the policy that were implemented, especially by Merkel in a 20 years tenure as the chief person in the EU, the most the most important person who was responsible for imposing some of the most stupid legislation and policies. It's too late now to reverse those things. You can't get those people and kick them out. All you have to do is just engage in a massive program of integration, but nobody seems to have the goal and the willingness to do it. There are areas in Sweden, for example, like Malmo, where there are open warfare between gangs. Germany itself is not terribly happy with a couple of millions in migration of refugees from God knows where. We are seeing the effect here in Britain as well, because France is quite happy to shift, to move on some of the immigrants, and all this kind of stuff. Ultimately ends up in every country does its own thing. There isn't a coordinated approach across the European Union, despite its bureaucratic nature. And this lack of principle, nobody seems to have an idea of how to deal with immigration. I mean, if Europe really wanted to be a force of good, you just continue with open borders. You make sure that people who come in are people who should be in, but unless they are, unless they are terrorists or criminals, you can deal with criminals and terrorists. You don't have to impose build a wall around it. Just deal with immigration based on the principle of individual freedom. Allow people to come in if they want to work. Get rid of all the welfare which attracted effectively parasitism from all over the world. If people want to come here because they want to contribute, they want to be richer, they want to work, fine, come in. But everything else has to be dealt with like you would dealt if it were originated by a native. If somebody starts setting up crime gangs or stuff like that, you should be intervening. We have legislation already in place. Really, there's nothing new you have to do. You just have to apply the law and apply the principles behind the reasons why immigration ultimately is good, if it's not skewed by a massive welfare system.
And of course, massively skewed by a fear of perceived racism among, police forces, etc., when it comes to actually enforcing the law. I think it's worth, just for the sake of balance, pointing out that in Sweden, the anti-immigration party actually only came fourth. And in Finland, the Finns party, which is the nationalist party, they went down and only got just over 7%. So there are some exceptions there which are interesting, and I can't explain necessarily at this point what the trend is there, or what that means, but that'd be something to watch in the future, I think, and to understand what's going on within those countries.
Yes, yeah. The trend of being unable to provide any kind of real solution to the immigration problem that's been in Europe for the last 10 years is a depressing trend, and I guess we're seeing it continuing. The other influence on this election, I guess, is going to have to be the war in Ukraine. And yet, I don't know, looking at the results, there doesn't seem to be a consistent trend of either voting for parties which are anti-Putin or parties which are kind of a bit more friendly. I think the AfD, which I think the AfD came second in Germany, was that right? I think they're broadly kind of a bit more friendly. I think there was some kind of quote that I saw about the leader of the AfD saying that, oh, we just have to talk to Putin, we'll get the gas back, something like that. And yet also there seems to be broader support for parties which are anti-Putin. Do you guys see any kind of impact of the Ukrainian war on these election results?
To be honest, no, I don't think it was one of the main issues. The main issues were mainly issues that affect the specific countries. So much so that, for example, take Ireland, for example. Ireland doesn't have really many issues. They got problems with immigration. Lately, lots of immigration has been going into Ireland. But the Sinn Féin, which is the most lefty, the party who wants a united Ireland, that's a USB. Otherwise, they're just a socialist party like anyone else. But they actually fared very badly in the election. And the two main centrist party, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, Fine Gael and Fine Fail, whatever they are called, they kind of did well. They kind of got to the same point. They're effectively the same party. God knows why you got two of them in Ireland, but that's the way it is. So some of the outcomes of this election are quite weird, probably because they're specific to the country where the election were held. And that's why some of the northern country went the opposite direction of the rest of Europe. But all in all, I don't think there was, apart from probably immigration, there wasn't a theme across every single country in this particular election.
Yeah, I mean, some of the Eastern Bloc countries obviously have more of a relevance when it comes to the Ukraine war.
Sure.
I'm not sure how many of those I can pull out as examples, but
although Slovakia, effectively the president won, his party won, so it wasn't like a surprise there either.
Yeah, in Czechia, the vote was won by the opposition, which is the guy called Andrej Babis. His ANO party, you may have heard of him in the past, or some people may have. I think Poland, Donald Tusk, who's a very well-known figure on the EU stage, his party came top, but only just. And just behind him was a Eurosceptic, far right party. Tusk got 37%. The inverted commas far right party got 36, and then behind that was another far right one, the 12% one. That was the one, that I mentioned in passing earlier. That had a candidate that was called Polish Confederation. Had a candidate that was well known for Christmas for Christmas time for taking a fire extinguisher and using it to extinguish a menorah. And he was certainly anti-Israel, and I don't know what his position on Ukraine was, but I can only fear that it could well be a pro-Putin end of the spectrum. But don't quote me on that. I don't know for certain.
Yeah. Okay. I guess, unfortunately, these results, although they're being reported as being seismic in the shift towards the right, and that seems to be broadly kind of true. The broad trends of European politics, I guess, seem to be the same. I'm surprised by this lack of impact to some extent of the Ukrainian war. I would have thought there would have been a larger impact of that, but I don't know. It's hard, as you say, it's hard to interpret a lot of what's going on in the European election results, as a lot of them are kind of so localized to each individual country. But any passing thoughts for people on this just in the last few minutes?
Yeah, I suppose that the overall policy of the EU will not change significantly in the next few years. That's for sure. Even a swing in the individual member state to the right doesn't really translate to a change in politics in the European Parliament. As I said, because the Commission is the body that actually decides the direction of travel, is not the Parliament. So that's another reason why you shouldn't expect anything significant coming out of this election.
And if you do a flip between the before and after, how the Parliament was set in 2019 when it last voted, and how it's now going to be divided, the difference is pretty slight, in a sense that the right-wing ones go, more of the pie becomes the right-wing parties, and the Greens and the Reds are reduced slightly. The Greens more noticeably. Of course, back in 2019, that was the period when all the school kids were on climate change strike, and Greta was running the show, and the Green Deal and all that was top of every newspaper. And of course, now we've moved on quite a bit from that in terms of people's priorities for cost of living and stuff. So it's in that sense, it's slight, but it's definitely a trend. And that it's a reflection of the continent as a whole, with a lot of nuance in it as well.
And we in Britain are Billy no mates, no longer with our own people there, but such is the way of things. But all right, everybody, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. Oh, I should say we have a $5 super chat from Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. I don't believe we have anything going live at 7. I think no, we don't have anything going live at 7. But all right, so we'll see you guys all tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.